Well, hello, and welcome to this webinar where we're exploring how companies can reduce their carbon footprints while at the same time growing their businesses. I'm Terry Slave, and I'm the Editor-in-Chief of Reuters Events Sustainable Business, and I'm delighted to be moderating this hour-long session. There'll be time to take questions at the end, so please be sure to submit them in the Q&A box, and we'll get to them towards the end. Before I introduce you to our fantastic speakers, I want to provide some of the context for today's discussion. Living within planetary boundaries while growing a business is not only an extremely tall order, it can seem a contradiction in terms. Scientists tell us that Earth Overshoot Day, when humanity's demand for ecological resources exceeds what the Earth can actually regenerate, is moving backwards every year. It fell on July 29th this year. And then there's the evidence mounting by the day that climate change is already here. And we saw this with the summer's truly frightening extreme weather events. Regulators, consumers, customers, investors are all telling companies they need to reduce their contribution to the dangerous increase in CO2 emissions. And there's also the pressing need to make their businesses more resilient in the face of what is increasingly looking like an uncertain future. But particularly for companies that have yet to engage with the climate agenda, and there are lots of them, the task of getting to grips with the emissions that are even within its direct control can seem mind-boggling in complexity. Luckily, there are new technologies, blockchain, Internet of Things, artificial intelligence. They've provided a lot more tools, but a company has to really understand which are the most cost-effective to use and how best to deploy them. And then there's a much larger problem of the emissions that are in a company's supply chains and in the use of its products, which can account for 80% of a carbon footprint. So companies can't address these issues on their own. They're bigger than any single company, and so they need to work in partnerships and some very unlikely alliances with NGOs, communities, even their own competitors. Again, it's not something that will come easily to many companies. So in this webinar, we'll look at where companies should look to take their first steps. And we are really very fortunate to have some truly expert speakers to help us. Bill Sisson, who's the Executive Director of World Business Council for Sustainable Development North America, Emma Keller, who's Head of Sustainability for Nestle UK, and Karim Youssef, who's General Manager for AI Applications and Blockchain at IBM. Welcome all of you. Bill, I think you might be a good person to kick us off, because with a big picture view, WBCSD recently published Vision 2050, calling for a world in which more than 9 billion people can live well within planetary boundaries by mid-century. That sounds like a really big ask. So can you explain how individual companies can contribute to that?
Sure, and let me just frame a little bit. Thank you, first of all, Terry, and the Reuters team for allowing me to be represented here among what I consider to be two very distinguished other guests from Nestle and IBM. So it's really a pleasure. And Terry, as you pointed out, Earth Overshoot Day fell this year on July 29th. You know, it's not going to be too long before we're going to be talking about Earth Doubling Day, if we keep on the current trends. So we took a look 10 years ago, over 10 years ago, and published what was our first version of Vision 2050. And on our 25th anniversary as an organization, which was last year, we worked together with 60 other member companies to really rethink that vision relative to this challenge at hand. So this is a vision that was assembled by business, for business, all business, to really take a hard look at the way forward that needs to be acted upon. So we aptly named this vision Time to Transform. It's no longer time to talk, it's time to act. And so what are the key action steps that we need to put forward? And in the vision, so to your question about how businesses can independently look where they sit in this transformation, we identified 9 pathways. And business will find its identity in those 9 pathways, whether you're an energy systems company, a food systems company, a products and materials company, a company in health, a company in finance, a company in the living spaces, a company in mobility. I think I've almost named all 9. But you'll find your identity as a business in those 9 pathways. And within those pathways, we've identified the framing of the needs for society, the needs for business, the needs for the actions that need to be undertaken, and specifically the business actions that need to be looked at and acted upon as part of each of those pathway transformations. And I'll wrap up here in a minute to hand over some other views to try to set this up. But this is about mindset shifts and leadership having to rethink the business models they operate in. The mindset shifts we identify and vision are around reinvention and thinking about capital markets and capitalism in a different way than just thinking about shareholder value, and considering the broader set of stakeholders we interact with and how we reinvent our business structures and thinking and capitalization around that. It's about building resilience and mindset shifts around how resilience is ultimately going to have to be thought through to anticipate, embrace, and adapt to what are going to be some pretty severe disruptions. And we've already gone through one. There's many going through them as we speak. Businesses are being disrupted, and we have to think differently about how we act together on that. And then regenerate. That's another mindset shift around going beyond the doing no harm mantra and really thinking about how we create results that allow systems to heal and thrive. And last but not least, I'll set up hopefully the conversation here is vision around those pathways, the transformation around those pathways, the mindset shifts that have to be undertaken are really framed around what we call the key enablers. The key enablers that are going to drive climate action, nature action, equity action, and transparency are going to be policy that are going to need to be supported and driven by business and for business. It's going to be around consumption and how we change behavior through how we market and how we inform the markets about the sustainable use of product. It's about finance and thinking about how we engage capital markets differently and getting capital markets to reward those companies that are taking the lead on these activities, whether it's through cost of capital, whether it's through investor confidence. It's really about how we better acknowledge the need for capital markets to be engaged in this conversation with us. And then last but not least, to set hopefully up a little bit of this conversation, the fourth enabler being technology. And really around, supportive technology that might be things like IBM will talk about, and digitalization and information management, and technology through research and development that's really oriented towards sustainability. It's not an outcome, it's an input to the R&D functions of organizations. So hopefully somewhere in there I answered your question, Terry. There's plenty of information and I will share to everyone in the chat. Hopefully there's a way for folks to see that, the link to the work that I encourage all the participants today to take knowledge of. Back to you, Terry.
Okay, thank you. Well, you talk about systems, and one of the things that's being discussed this week, in fact, is the food system at the UN Food System Summit. And on top of that, as part of that, the World Benchmarking Alliance just published its ranking of companies on where they sit in terms of food system transformation, not just on climate, but also on the SDGs. And it's actually quite depressing reading, because I think it's only 26 out of the 350 they rank are actually incorporating, working to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in line with the Paris Agreement. And very lucky to have Emma here, because Nestle has done very, very well in this, coming second behind Unilever. So Nestle. So Emma, what is it that Nestle has done right about it, and and why is the rest of the sector doing so badly? and how do you overcome the challenges?
Thanks, Terry, and thank you, Bill, for those inspiring open. I've obviously read the report in detail, and I think it's really important for lots of people to look at and help implement some of those things in their business. I mean, the World Benchmarking Alliance is really great to see. It's fantastic to see we're in second place. It's the first time they've looked at the food and agriculture sector in this way. So I think that's a real recognition of the role the food and agriculture sector has, both in contributing to climate change, but also as the potential for it to be part of the solution. So it's really good to start to get that sense of where the sector is. And as you say, Terry, there's a lot of companies that are still yet to step up and move. So I think the reason we've done really well in it is because we're not looking at this fresh. We're not starting from a standing start on this. We know, and we've been recognized that we recognize that our business, of course, depends on nature for the very ingredients that we source to make our products. And so climate change is therefore one of the biggest threats to our business. If we see increased crop failures, more droughts, changes in rainfall patterns, etc., we won't be able to source the quantity, the quality, and the sustainable ingredients that we need to make our products. So it's absolutely essential that we take action. So we've been working on sustainability for well over 2 decades. But in 2019, we really stepped up and made our commitment on climate change to be net zero. And at the time, we didn't have all the answers. And as Bill says, we're moving beyond the time of commitment into the time of action. So we had about a year to then go and do our homework in detail to really understand, okay, we've said we're going to do this. We've put it out there to the world to hold us to account. How on earth are we going to get there? And that's where we really had to look across the whole business, work with colleagues and externals to help us really understand what are the big levers of change we need to push on if we're going to get there. And actually, a lot of them talk to some of those enablers and trends that Bill has set out. We absolutely have to reduce the impact of our own operations, which actually is very small, between 2 and 4% for our own operations. The lion's share of our impact is in our upstream supply chain. As you mentioned, nearly 80% for most food businesses is with agriculture. So if we didn't include that whole chunk, we're literally tweaking around the edges. And so I really do hope that this benchmark starts to show and help move other companies to say, okay, you can't just focus on your own operations, you really have to look at the whole system. So the reason I think we've scored so highly is our commitment is global in scope. So it will cover all our operations and supply chains across the 186 countries we are present in. It's aligned to the science-based targets. So we've been verified externally. We've worked with the Science-Based Target Initiative to set a 1.5 degree aligned commitment. And we've looked across our whole value chain, right from the upstream inputs and manufacture of our ingredients through to the end of life when our products are disposed of. So we really do have a comprehensive plan in place. And for the next 5 to 10 years, we're quite certain on the actions we need to take, and we know the direction we need to go in. Beyond that, it gets more uncertain. We need to be ready to jump onto the new technologies, the innovations in ingredients and supply chains and business models. We need to be ready to stand up and advocate for policy shifts that will help drive the sector along. We need to build in all those different things if we're actually going to get past that hurdle, because we know what we need to do now, but the future is less clear.
Okay, you said you weren't looking at it from a standing start, but what would you say to a company that is looking at it from a standing start, which is thinking, everyone's talking about net zero. We're going to lose customers here, potentially, we're going to lose investors. Where would you say they should start on that journey?
The key thing is really to just understand, where are you now? And I hope that by organizations like ours and many others publishing what we've done, we're kind of showing others how you get started. We're giving them a bit of direction, and actually encourage others to use what we've put out there, etc., to help them. So the key thing is to start. First place would be, look at where you are now. Start to gather the data you've got. Data doesn't have to be perfect. You don't need every bit of information before you get going. Just use what you've got, get a good picture of your baseline, and then set that commitment into the future. Net zero would be great. And then start to identify, okay, where are the big hotspots within our organization, and what do we need to do to get there? And hopefully that also then shows where there are opportunities to collaborate and work together, because even though we've come second in this benchmark and we've got a really robust commitment and plan, we can't do it alone. So achieving that plan is not going to be done by Nestle colleagues only. We absolutely have to work with our partners, our supply chain, our farmers, our customers, and our consumers if we're genuinely to get there. And I think many other organizations are going to find the same, that we all need to be in this together. And I think that's where some of the excitement is about how we can really work together to deliver and achieve more than the sum of our parts.
Prima, I'd like to bring you into this conversation because IBM has also set some very ambitious climate targets. You've announced this year you'll be achieving net zero not by 2050, but by 2030. You've set interim targets for 2025, cutting emissions by 65% compared to 2010. Obviously, the task for you is not going to be quite as big as for a company like Nestle. But I mean, how stretching is that 2025 target for IBM?
Well, look, I think in terms of IBM and its own operations, I mean, it's a very ambitious target, right? I think you just asked the question about where does one start? And I think often you start with what can you control, right? Your mobile emissions, your buildings, right? Your manufacturing processes in as much as you have them. A big focus for us, if you think about those targets, for example, has been sourcing from renewable energy. And so we achieved our goal of spending more than 50%. Actually, we did 56% back in 2020. That was 5 years before 2025. And that's allowed us to set a goal for 75% by 2030. That's just a simple example of picking something that you can then be really deliberate about. So, you know, it's a stretch in the sense that there are many factors that you have to work through, but it also guides you to really start being deliberate. It's been transforming things that we do in our packaging for the mainframe, as an example, just thinking about the materials that go into the pallets that are used to transport them and package them up when they're delivered to customers. Real opportunities, and the team actually won an internal award for the great thinking that they did in reducing that, in enabling recycling, so on and so forth. So I think it's really about, it's ambitious, but it's appropriate, right? Where nobody's gonna get anywhere. We're not gonna have the impact we need without, you know, giving ourselves some real meaningful goals. And then obviously, logically and deliberately working our way towards them.
So how important are technologies to delivering, you know, on your own goals in terms of internally on your own, on making your own processes more efficient, for example?
Well, yeah, I sit at a weird intersection of I'm a technologist. I build technologies that are used by IBM to achieve its own goals, and indeed by clients or customers of mine to similarly, you know, achieve goals. So I serve, you know, as a provider to IBM and to others. And I think technology has always been about enabling us to do the things that, you know, that we need to do better and easier. Whether it is synthesizing lots of data so that you can very quickly make the informed decisions, whether it's integrating, you know, information flow so that you can get a more holistic picture, whether it's automating tasks that need to then occur thereafter. It's all been about, you know, in many ways what technology has done. And, you know, 3 quick tangible examples of how we focused on it and how, you know, IBM leverages itself. You know, first of all, you think about the management of your critical assets. An example of that would be your facilities, right? Facilities, real estate, or if you're in the industrial side, your industrial equipment, it could be your fleets. All of these things are key elements of driving carbon emissions or consuming energy, and you need to get a holistic view on them and begin to manage your processes around them. So technology can help there. Another one is obviously your supply chain, right? The supply chain, reducing waste, inventory optimization. It's all about transparency, provenance, and understanding. Once again, this is about connecting data sources and data points and creating an irrefutable record that allows people to actually act. This is where blockchain, for example, has played as an enabling technology. And last but not the least, in doing all of this, and kind of to Emma's point of how do you even know where you are? And how do you keep measuring? How do we take out the operational cost and complexity of what I would call ESG reporting and ultimately compliance? Because you are talking about pulling data from many a source, synthesizing, analyzing it. There's levels of fuzzy logic you have to, quite frankly, apply. In certain cases, approximation on approximation on approximation. So taking the cost out of that, leveraging AI to make it somewhat simpler, dealing with the data integration problems, and most importantly, surfacing that data in a way whereby operational decisions can be made. That's kind of how we're focused and kind of how you bring technology to bear, both within IBM itself and indeed serving any of our enterprise customers.
I guess, I mean, there just seems to be an explosion of data available. So how do you, I mean, there must be a big job in just kind of curating it and knowing, setting it in context and knowing what's the important, you know, they always say you can't manage what you can't measure, but it sounds like if you're measuring everything and trying to manage everything at the same time, that's a huge, you know, that seems almost daunting in complexity. So how do you go about starting, really?
I think it really it begins with picking, I like to think in terms of entities. So think of it as an asset class. It starts with picking something that you can make tangible. Any complex problem is best solved by breaking it down into simpler problems. So as I said, take real estate. What's the state of your buildings? How much energy are you consuming? What are you learning from your utility bills? How are you working with those utility providers to begin to do more renewable resourcing? What's your space planning, your optimal use of spaces, right? How is occupancy actually being done? Now, all of these things are a little bit different right now. We're in the midst of the pandemic, but you know, the logic still applies, right? How are you using that space and how are you optimizing it? It's a little nugget, but it's a place to start. And I would like to say, you know, we've been solving data problems, and I say this as an industry, a technology industry. I mean, data has been at the heart of what has driven information technology. It's interesting, we still refer to it as IT, information technology, because it's all been about data and gaining understanding from it. So in that regards, we have new techniques, we leverage machine learning, we bring in AI and all that. You know, there are new techniques we use, but the mechanics, the philosophies are very, very consistent. Decompose into an understandable whole, begin to build yourself up, right? And so you begin to have your top down and bottoms up, and then the magic is how you always get them to meet in the middle.
How cost effective is this? I mean, AI, machine learning, it all sounds quite expensive to invest in that kind of thing. I mean, what are the payback times in terms of, say, the energy efficiency gains you can get?
I think I would contend it's, in the face of all that needs to be done, it's a lot less expensive than you might actually wish to believe. Remember, I think what's key, and this is what I think is important for us as technologists, where I seek to differentiate us as IBM, it's all about bringing these technologies to bear in a way that can seamlessly fit in to what someone's trying to do. So let's take a supply chain example. There are today existing folks, supply chain analysts, who look at the state of the supply chain. They're trying to understand where inventory is. They're trying to manage for disruptions. You have to look at how they work and bring technologies and tool sets, I call them destination tools, things that they can live in and do their work, that meet their working need and begin to integrate in these kind of perspectives and views. And so what it becomes is that it almost becomes a bit like in the doing. It's like, you know, we talk about getting healthier or eating healthier. You still eat breakfast. It's what you eat, right? So you're slipping in to the mechanics of what folks tend to do. And I would contend that, you know, payback is relatively simple to work out. If you're making better informed decisions, if you're better using your resources, if you're getting more efficiency in your supply chain, if you're reducing waste, these are very clear, you know, numbers that can be calculated. The return on investment becomes pretty self-evident, and in that regards is not complicated. I think where people make the mistake is when they think of it as this whole other thing. It's not this whole other thing. It is looking at what you're doing and how we begin to enable that to be better.
I would just,
sorry.
can I just add,
Yeah, of
Terry,
course.
I think the good news is there is a lot of data being collected. You know, how does Emma know that the scope 1 and 2 emissions at Nestle are what they are? It's because they've got a fairly robust internal process for how to capture the right information around measuring at least their own footprint. And that's, you know, back a little bit back to your question on how do you get started. You get started by first taking stock in yourself and working with companies like IBM who have knowledge and expertise in terms of guiding companies towards the materiality of the information that's important to them as a company that operates in a particular sector. I'm sure they're able to help in that regard. The bigger challenge, and where the data perhaps isn't being as robustly collected, is in the supply chains. You know, the numbers, I've worked with, we have a member company that works with us called EcoVadis, and they're very active in measuring small and medium enterprises around their helping companies establish where they are in their ESG journey, if you will. And the challenge is really only a small percentage, maybe 20% or so of the small medium enterprise base is actually doing that deeper assessment that needs to be accomplished. So we need more data. But the more the data is existing, we need technology to help define and sort through it so that companies like Nestle can be assured the quality and information that they're pulling up from the supply chain is valid, accurate, because their problem isn't their own emissions. Sorry, Emma. Their problem is the scope 3 problem, which is what we call the supply chain and the consumption problem of their product. So maybe Emma, you have a few things you'd like to add to that, but I just thought I'd set that up for us.
What's your biggest, what's Nestle's biggest challenge on the data front?
It's exactly as Bill and Kareem laid out. It's each end, both ends is really difficult to get the data. So farmers who of course are working in highly unpredictable environments, it's all about nature. You can have a farm one year with a carbon footprint that can be tripled, doubled, halved in the next year, whatever it might be, because of a different pattern of rainfall or a pest infestation on their farm or a shortage of a particular material that they apply. It can completely change year on year. So part of it is actually collecting the data. Also, farmers are farmers. They're supposed to be on the land growing ingredients. We're not supposed to lock farmers up in a room and have them fill out hundreds of thousands of surveys and questionnaires from all of their value chain that are buying from them. So it's about how do we do that in an effective way? And of course, farmers are also really savvy business people. They know their farm, they understand what they're applying to it, they know what they get back. So they're already collecting data. Our challenge is how do we make that data how do we stretch that data to do more for us? So if they've already got really good data in because they have to for their costs, we can actually use that data to calculate carbon emissions. We don't need to ask them all over again. So it's very much back to Kareem's point about actually it's got to be the right data to help us make the right decisions. And to be honest, sometimes I can see tons of data from some of our supply chain. I'm like, what do we do with this? And I think that's also what we need to be cautious of, is not just asking for data for data's sake, because we think we need more and more information. It's the right data to make the right decisions. So absolutely upstream supply chain, the movement of ingredients through that value chain from farm to processing to secondary processing, distributed to manufacturing to finished products before it even gets to us is really complex. Not impossible, and there are lots of amazing solutions out there, but it is really challenging and we need to collect it quite frequently. The second big chunk for us, of course, is consumption. So once we've sold our products, if you think of something like coffee, a big part of our coffee footprint is from how consumers boil a kettle or what energy provider they've got in their home, something we have no control of. But what we can try and do is try and understand how are our consumers using these products, so we can either design them differently that they can produce it more efficiently, or we can work with others or encourage consumers to behave differently with their products. So a great example, of course, is in pod coffee, which go into pod machines. We know big part of our footprint in that is the actual pods that often end up as waste. So we're actually working with our biggest competitor, who would normally never sit in a room with, but it's really exciting because we have a shared challenge. Our biggest competitor to say, okay, how do we get these pods back? Because it's clearly the biggest part of our footprint. We've come up with a scheme called Pod Back, where we can start to recover not just the plastic pods, but also the spent coffee grounds within them. And if we can get those back and encourage a more circular system, we can upcycle and reuse the plastic, but we can also valorize the spent coffee grounds and turn it into other materials, whether that's a fertilizer for some of our farms, so reducing inputs another way, or a feedstock for another system. So it's really and what's been able to show us that is the data. So really having that data has helped us go, okay, we can see what the problem is. Now let's work together to find a solution.
Doesn't it also, I mean, in terms of planetary boundaries, you have to be, circularity, the circular economies can be really critical, and the recycling and reuse and all that, and revalor, and not downcycling either, having upcycling or having, and that involves some different parts of the value chain, that can involve very different companies working together. How do companies work through that to try and to address? I mean, what partners has Nestle worked with on circular economy?
We've got loads, lots of different partners. I think that's exactly why events like this are really important, because you never know who you're going to reach, and often it's, I mean, we all know in the sector you get good stuff done when you work with good people. And actually, a lot of it is just about those relationships. So it's really important for events like this where we can turn up and someone can say, I heard you talking about this. Can I understand it more? And who knows, there might be a joint solution there. And I think that's what's going to be really exciting about COP26, of course, at the end of the year as well, is not just the political piece, which is essential, of course, getting governments to commit, but actually where businesses can exchange on shared challenges and join forces, which can definitely make a bigger solution, but also can share the risk. Some of this stuff that we're trying to do is new. We have to be brave. We don't know if it's going to work, and we need to be able to be willing to fail or test and learn. And I think actually when we can do that together, share the risk, and then not be shy about sharing our results, whether they're successful, which we'll definitely happily share, but also sharing those failings so that others don't make the same mistake. So these kind of events are essential for that. In terms of our partners, so we work with our retail partners, of course, our key customers. We work with others in the sector. We work with different, like we've got a partnership at the moment with Plastic Energy, where we're looking at trying to recover some of the really difficult to recycle plastics, the flexible plastics. Think of your crisp packets and your confectionery wrappers, etc. Notoriously difficult to recycle. But by working with organizations like that, we can try and reclaim that material, put it back into the system so that us and others can start buying recycled content, which actually is a shortage on the market. So it's really important to invest in the infrastructure and work with unusual partners to help us get there.
What about IBM?
I was going to actually add to that point to say, I actually think that the desire to collaborate is much more easier today than maybe it has ever been. Because there's a notion of business value. And as I like coming back to business decisions made, if you take, for example, the Food Trust Collaborative Network that IBM supports, Nestle is part of, as I look at the various members who come into that in order to share data, their suppliers, and link, as we said, up and down the supply chain, they're all shaped by a common desire to make sure we got clarity, make sure they have got clarity. Right? It began in the realms of food safety, but I would tell you it's really expanded much more to just this notion of how can I actually understand what's going on so I can make many more informed decisions. I'm seeing the same thing go on in mining as an example, right? You're seeing more consortiums. I was recently with a customer of ours, Shell, and a set of mining concerns in Australia, where they had brought them together to just all of them, so to speak, you could consider them competitors, but they're all working and they all know that they want to address key issues around mining right? And essentially its impact on energy, the energy production ultimately. I'm finding that this collaborative spirit is there. I don't think it impacts what I would call competitive differentiation. That's the thing that people have often worried about. Oh, am I sharing some secret or not? I think the world is somewhat matured, and folks realize what we're talking about here actually just helps everyone to be better. And it's not on this level that your differentiation matters. Your differentiation matters in the quality of your product, whom you're serving, what it means to them, so on and so forth. But this level of collaboration is just essential to keep us all, here, so to speak. So I think we're finding it a lot more open than you might imagine, or you might logically think.
Bill, presumably that's part, that must be part and parcel of the Vision 2050 is a lot of you have to transform systems, not just companies. And that requires, a lot of different partners working
Absolutely.
together.
I mean, the fundamental premise of WBCSD's existence is around building collaboration into the structures that we need to address. Because, there's some comments that I won't get into in the Q&A, but, no one company at WBCSD can solve the problems alone that need to be solved. It's going to have to be done through collaboration. But we know the members of our organization are dedicated to that cause and are going to find ways to work towards finding solutions, because business can't exist in an unsustainable world. It just can't. And so if the world is 3 or 4 degrees warmer in 50 years or 30 years, I suppose, from now, what's business going to actually do in that world? I'm sure Nestle is very concerned about that, and I'm sure IBM is very concerned about that. So we have concerned business leaders working with us towards these objectives. In terms of the circularity, conversation, I'm very disappointed to announce that 90% of the waste stream is linear today. That's just not sustainable. And what we need to help companies do, and some of the work we've done as an organization, again, we're member-led, so our members do this with us. We don't tell them what to do. They provide us with the insights and the guidance for what they think needs to be done. We've developed a set of what we call circular transition indicators. And there are metrics around how do you as a company measure your circularity and become more aware of not just recycling content, but how do we reduce the amount of material we might put into a particular product that we sell upstream? How do we rethink about reusing materials as part of our design? I mean, these are big, tough questions, but we wanted to wrap a set of metrics and indicators around these types of elements of circularity so members can start to better understand and measure their practical sort of implementation of that as part of their business model.
And I guess, circularity is really important in terms of the climate impacts as well. So it's tackling waste, and it is not only important from an environmental point of view, just in terms of pollution, but also from the corporate point of view in terms of tackling the climate crisis. How do we move from that linear economy? That's, it seems a huge shift to get to become more circular. And I think a lot of it has to be, different service models for business as well. Different companies not maybe producing things, but providing services. And there's a lot of talk about that.
Definitely. And I think it's back to that mindset shift that Bill outlined at the very beginning, is that we've always seen the packaging as it's one-time use, it's end of life, it's a delivery vehicle for us to consume the product, and then it has no value. And actually the system is optimized so much to make it have no value. So we need to just turn that on its head, because we've realized there's too much out there. I think we're already seeing massive movements in a more positive direction to increase circularity. I don't know if you saw last week, but some of the retailers, Tesco in particular, launched a major trial with Loop, who are a recycling platform that try to do exactly that. And they've launched it with nearly 90 products in store, where actually customers will pay a little bit more initially for their product in a reusable container, and then that gets refunded when they bring it back. And these containers are made much more solid and robust. They're handed in at the supermarket, cleaned, and you get another one. So really trying to put value back into that system and change behavior. We're also seeing government move in this direction. Of course, there's a huge amount of work underway around deposit return schemes. And of course, Scotland are leading the way. And on the plastics tax, where actually there's going to be a tax on companies that aren't using a minimum amount of recycled material in the system. So these are all positive movements that can change the way companies look at this, can drive innovation. And I think that's what the challenge of policy has to do. It really has to actually get to the root cause of the challenge here and drive innovation and change, and not just find alternative systems, because yeah, as you say, we just cannot continue to pump out materials in the way that we do today.
Just looking at some of the questions we've had, there's a sense of big business as being responsible for this problem, and a distrust of its ability to actually tackle it. I mean, how do you overcome this? There's obviously a lot of distrust, and I mean, there's a lot of distrust of the fossil fuel companies, for example, who are, you know, the big companies who are saying we should take a lead in changing the energy systems because, you know, we're expert in that. But a lot of people saying, well, you know, why they're not prepared to change their business model. They're just trying to push hydrogen because they know in reality there won't be green hydrogen isn't actually going to happen. You know, is there an answer to that?
I think you have to look at and carefully look at what companies are saying, and then look at what they're doing. By just saying, obviously, that creates the distrust. But if you can find the information on what they're doing and the actions they're taking, I think that starts to send the right signals about some of the directions these companies are going in rethinking their business models for the future. I give an example of an announcement that was made a few weeks ago with a large commodities provider of soybeans, working with a large oil and gas company on how do we rethink use of that service, that commodity, in the context of aviation fuels. Now, I don't want to get into all the arguments about food supply and interaction and such, but these are the unique, I think Karim said it best, the collaboration environment is real. When do you have a soybean commodity provider talking to an oil and gas company? When has that happened in history? And how do we work through those variations of what business models need to look like from these traditional big companies differently, and allow them the flexibility to drive that agenda? At WBCSD, we have 5 member conditions that we're asking all our members to sign up to by the end of next year. The first is setting net zero greenhouse gas objectives and using science-informed methods to drive them. The second being around being nature positive. And we're building the set of metrics that will help companies understand what that means. The third around and fourth around equity in not just the workforce, but the supply chains and how you treat and interact with your consumption and your consumers. The human rights element that goes along with that. And the fifth criteria and condition around transparency and aligning with some of the key now governing or I want to use governing, but at least standardized sort of sets of criteria that are coming forward around TCFD and risk assessments with COSO frameworks that get into ESG assessments for companies that are important for companies to be taking into their disclosure of information. So I think the tide has shifted. The investors are speaking. it's not just CSR communications, and I hate to use the term greenwashing because somebody will probably jump all over that. It's no longer allowed. It is about demonstrating what you as a company are committed to, how you're measuring yourself against that commitment, and then how you're actually demonstrating the actions you're taking forward. And I think we're going to see a big shift in that over the next, it's already happening, but I think it needs to happen in the next 7 years, or we're not going to be on a very favorable planet.
That's
Yeah,
very
I
new
might-
though, isn't it? It's quite new now, your requirement for your members to actually sign up to all these. And these are some of the 200 biggest companies in the
That's right.
world. In the same way that science-based targets, it's only, I mean, one of the criticisms there has been companies can sign up to them, but there's been no real follow-up to see if they're actually, if they're actually doing what they're saying, what they're signing up to do. But these standards are going to be coming in, and there's going to be a global standard for science for net zero carbon business, which is going to come, which is hopefully that will take some of the concern about the greenwash out of the net zero promises. I mean, Emma, how does Nestle counter those greenwash concerns when, oh, sure, you say you're going to be compliant with the Paris Agreement? How can you prove that you're going to deliver on that?
We have no choice. We have to deliver on it. The commitment is out there. I think it's still early days. A lot of these net zero commitments have only materialized in the last few years. So a lot of companies are still at the start of that journey. I think what's important as well is that it's looking at the milestones. So at Nestle, we've set ourselves milestones on that journey, because we can't say net zero by 2050 and then leave our homework to 2040. We really need to be getting on with it now. So we've set ourselves a milestone of getting to 20% by 2025, which of course doesn't sound as much, but is really focusing the mind of the business, because that's still a massive reduction that we need to make. And we know the low-hanging fruit, and they've already been done. So there's other things we need to start looking at. And then more importantly, we're looking at halving by 2030, 9 years away. That's not a long time, given many companies made commitments in 2010 for 2020, and we didn't quite get there. I think what the IPCC report and all the world's leading scientists are showing us is that we can't keep talking, we need to be acting, much to what Bill's been saying. So I think we're going to be held accountable for our actions, not our verbal commitments. So that's why the fifth piece of Bill's ask on transparency is so key. We have to be communicating progress along the way. We have to be talking about it. We have to be sharing our learnings and our findings, and be open and honest and humble about where we are.
And is it also to perhaps be a bit more open in collaborating with competitors? Is that something that needs to happen too? Definitely.
And Kareem talked very eloquently about collaboration earlier. It's one of these overused terms. We hear it at every event. It's collaboration is key, and we all know that, but it's probably a bit of an underutilized practice. So that the energy is there, the willingness is there, finding the means to do that collaboration. There's great examples, of course, and lots of it's going on, but we're going to need more of that. So really important that we're open, that we're able to have those conversations, and that we're doing it in a way that meets our shared needs, and actually piles others in as well. And I think also partnering with government, collaborating with government where we can through public-private partnerships are going to be a real key unlocker for the future challenges we face.
Kareem, what are you thinking about?
Well, I'm actually slightly more optimistic than maybe the tone in the questions. If the companies that produce this stuff don't start tackling this problem, who will? Right? I spent literally last week, I was with a cement manufacturer, and cement and concrete actually is a huge part of what you would call carbon emissions. I was actually stunned, very pleasantly stunned, by the depth of thought they had been applying to this subject, whether it was in looking at low carbon formulation for cement, whether it was doing more research and understanding that concrete actually absorbs CO2 and how could they leverage that in kind of improving their cycle, whether it was just in the processes of what they were even trying to measure. And some plants were fully digital and some plants were pen and paper, you know what I mean? But they were really into it because they felt compelled that this building material, which we know is all essential to providing shelter, so to speak, has to, evolve. And so I think we should all be a little careful, maybe a little bit more charitable, right? In thinking about all these entities. I mean, we didn't get here in a day, and we're not going to get away from here in a day either, right? There were real needs being met. In certain cases, there were lack of knowledge, right? Some folks started real early. IBM's been talking about this thing for 50 years. We talked about Nestle and others. Weren't paying attention and hey, I got to get in there and grow, whatever it might be. I think we've got to just give room for everybody to begin, right? The journey of 1,000,000 miles begins with a step. And I do think I'm seeing people take steps, right? That's the simple truth. And if everybody's taking a step, regardless of where they came from or what they did in the past, I think that's to be applauded, that's to be supported, that's to be driven and emphasized, because we all will get there together, right? There's no other way. Policy will help. Regulation will invariably become important, and that's always a great forcing function. But if we're forcing people to think this way, start taking these steps, we're not going to make the progress we need, right? Folks need to actually believe, and I'm seeing a lot more belief in the enterprises than you might think. And so I'm quietly optimistic, right?
Can I ask, there's one question about who do you think will be a catalyst for behavioral change? What do you think would make it more successful than what's happened before? That's a real question, is if consumers are asking, for example, if they want these big luxury SUVs, and yet these are one of the major issues in terms of trying to decarbonize the transport sector. Who's going to tell those consumers, you shouldn't be driving big SUVs, you should be driving small, smaller cars?
Well, I think you're hitting on the joint responsibility of all of us, though, by the way, right? And so consumers in their own right, I think, are a big driver. I know that when I deal with customers, a lot of the question of our brand perception, brand empathy is becoming important. Consumers are becoming more and more informed, and I think they're going to be a big influencer, right? I think that you're also going to find that there is peer pressure, whether you consider that investor-led or just even employee-led, where people are choosing where they want to work and who they want to work for, right? These, I think, are exerting additional pressures that are putting this on boardrooms, on boardrooms tables. Ultimately, as I said, I think regulation or standardization and all have their place, and they actually do help. But I think there's a lot of pressure coming out from consumer and what I would call social peer pressure, that whether you think of that as employee-driven or investor-driven, that is shaping the way ahead.
Any other thoughts on that?
I'd completely agree that there isn't one group that's going to trigger this. It's everybody, and it's something I talk to colleagues about all the time, is that we all need to be part of this sustainability journey, not just those that have sustainability in their job title, because we need the scientists, the financial experts, the communicators. We need all the different skill sets if we're going to get there. And we certainly, and the phrase we often use is, if not us, then who? And if not now, then when? And I think that thing's true for all of us. We all need to take action. I think one group that I've been really excited to see, who have been a major catalyst for change at all levels of so many organizations, is youth. The future is youth, and we're all doing this to protect future generations who are going to have to inherit a planet in peril unless we act. And we can all relate to that through kids or grandkids or whatever it might be. And seeing the youth who are our future employees, who are our future consumers. The youth, the young people of today are going to hold the majority of the wealth as the young middle class in the UK in the next 10 years. These are the people we really need to be listening to. They're much more engaged, they're much more switched on, and they have the same amount of data as I do at the touch of a button, because they've all got smartphones and computers. So we really need to be listening to them. So it's something we're certainly exploring internally, is how do we do reverse mentoring, where our typically older leaders listen to our younger, more junior members of staff. How do I get some of my younger colleagues to actually talk about their eco-anxiety, the fact that they are facing mental health challenges and are scared and worried about the future, and they want to come and work for a company that's doing the right thing. So that's one group it's been fantastic to watch. Of course, there's people like Greta and Clover Hogan out there who are just inspiring so many people, but this has got to be part of everybody's thoughts.
Yeah, and I couldn't agree more with Kareem and Emma. The way we've structured it back to vision is maybe a way to frame how behavior change, if you will, is going to ultimately adapt. And it's going to be driven certainly around policy mechanisms, and certainly around standards that the policymakers will put towards the business community. It is going to be driven around the financing models that come forward. So making it attractive or more attractive to invest in the sustainable product through the financing structure that you may have to leverage for that investment. And then, changing the idea that sustainable lifestyles are somehow deprivative or somehow negative. Rather, sustainable lifestyles are good. And they're good for not only you, but for all that are around you. And so that's part of the company's rethinking its role and how it positions products and services. And then last but not least, the technology element. So how does technology and research and development and new product design and all that thinking actually produce those products that the consumers will want ultimately in the end? And I agree with Emma very much so on the youth of today are going to be very active in driving the consumption of the future. And we as businesses need to be prepared for the fact that they are going to want, in your example, Terry, the smaller, lower carbon electric cars that we need to start putting into the product lines now. I'll leave it there.
Only got a few minutes left. Just wanted to ask you, each of you, what, if you have 3 or 4 key takeaways, what you would want to give as your takeaways. Kareem, do you want to start?
Look, I think my takeaway is be deliberate, right? The journey of a million miles starts with a step. So figure out your step. Often it starts by just understanding where you are and then picking something to work on. It's true in life as it is true in running a business. You pick something and just start working on it. And so that would be my takeaway. That's what I'm focused on. That's what I think others should do. Just pick somewhere to get started and get started.
I would build on that and just say, don't waste energy, don't waste food, but absolutely don't waste time. The time to start is now. And there's so much out there to learn from, to build on. So if companies haven't yet made a commitment, absolutely now is the time.
And I'd say we're all in this together. Some will think business is the problem. I think of business as the solution. It's what makes the world go round. Businesses are what drive economies. They're what drive societies. They're what drive lifestyles. And so business is part of the solution. And we're all in this together to help make that and enable that to happen.
That sounds like a very good note to end on. Thank you very much, all of you, for sharing your insights this afternoon. It's been a really good webinar, and thank you very much.